In May 2018, two hunters were making their way through a wooded area near a highway in Snohomish County, Washington, when they came across something unusual. Amid the dense brush and natural debris, they noticed a suitcase, worn, dirty, and oddly out of place in such a remote, natural setting. Its presence immediately struck them as suspicious, prompting them to contact local authorities. When investigators arrived at the scene, they carefully examined the suitcase. Its contents were disturbing enough to warrant immediate transport to a forensic laboratory for further analysis. What followed was a painstaking process of scientific testing and investigation. DNA testing later confirmed what Jamie's family had long feared, but never wanted to accept. The DNA belonged to Jamie Haggard. The discovery was devastating. Jamie's loved ones, especially her children and her father, had held on to the possibility that she might return one day, perhaps having gone away to rebuild her life in secret. Now that hope was extinguished. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. In this documentary, we will explore the true story and examine photos of a vibrant woman, Jamie Haggard, who was born in 1988 in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Washington State, where she would go on to spend nearly her entire life nestled within the greater Seattle metropolitan area. Raised amid the lush, rainy backdrops and suburban neighborhoods characteristic of the region, Jamie became a well-known and cherished presence within her community. From her earliest days, she stood out for her spirited personality, her infectious laughter, and the kindness that radiated through her interactions with others. Friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances remembered Jamie as someone who had a unique ability to light up a room with her energy and warmth. More than just a vibrant personality, Jamie was deeply rooted in the roles she held within her family. She was a beloved daughter and a caring sister, but the most profound identity she embraced was that of a mother. Jamie had two daughters, and from the moment she entered motherhood, her entire world shifted. She poured her time, attention, and love into raising her children, often sacrificing her own needs to ensure they had stability, affection, and every opportunity she could provide. Jamie's upbringing was shaped by the dynamics of a blended family. Her father, Lee Haggard, remained a consistent and supportive figure throughout her life, offering both guidance and emotional support during pivotal moments. Despite the inevitable ups and downs that come with growing up in a complex family structure, Jamie maintained strong relationships with several relatives and learned to navigate life's challenges with resilience. She attended public schools in the area, and classmates from those years often recall her as someone who was approachable, empathetic, and always willing to lend a listening ear. As she transitioned into adulthood, Jamie's focus increasingly narrowed to her children. Her love for them was not only visible in her words, but evident in every choice she made. Despite facing various economic and personal hardships, she never let those struggles interfere with the emotional security she worked to create for her daughters. According to friends, Jamie often placed her children's happiness above all else. She was the type of mother who stayed up late helping with school projects, who clipped coupons to stretch the family budget, and who always tried to make birthdays feel special, even when funds were tight. In addition to her maternal role, Jamie was a source of emotional support for those around her. She was a nurturer at heart, someone who checked in on loved ones regularly, offered encouragement in times of stress, and quietly carried the emotional weight of others, even when her own burdens were heavy. She was particularly close to her father and kept in frequent contact with him. Her consistency in communication was so reliable that any prolonged silence from Jamie immediately raised red flags among her family members. By the year 2016, Jamie's circumstances had grown more complicated. She had moved into a home shared with her stepbrother, David Haggard, as a temporary solution during a difficult time. The arrangement, while seemingly practical, came with tension. The household dynamics were strained by financial pressure, unresolved emotional baggage, and underlying interpersonal conflict. Jamie had reportedly confided in her mother and a close friend that David's temper could be unpredictable. Though she did not go into explicit detail, her concerns hinted at a toxic environment. Despite the tension, Jamie continued to prioritize her daughters. She kept routines in place for them, remained active in their daily lives, and stayed connected with friends and relatives. However, she rarely spoke openly about her own internal struggles. She tended to bottle things up, leaving much of her emotional world hidden from even those who cared for her most. On June 9, 2016, what began as a seemingly ordinary summer day took a dramatic and unexplainable turn. Jamie's children were reportedly at home, and David was occupied with his usual routine. Nothing out of the ordinary had been reported by neighbors or acquaintances. There were no loud arguments, no disturbances, just the quiet normalcy of suburban life. Yet, as the day wore on and calls to Jamie's phone went unanswered, concern quickly escalated into fear. Jamie, who always kept her phone within reach to remain available for her children and family, had gone completely silent. In the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, those closest to Jamie hoped, perhaps desperately, that she had simply needed time to herself. Maybe she had left for a short trip to clear her head, or perhaps she was staying with a friend and hadn't yet had the chance to inform anyone. But as hours turned into days and then into a week with no word, the hope began to fade. Her phone remained off, her social media accounts inactive, and most troubling of all, there was no contact with her daughters. Several days had passed since anyone had heard from Jamie Haggard, and the uneasy silence surrounding her absence grew more deafening with each hour. Eventually, her mother could no longer ignore the growing dread and took the crucial step of contacting local law enforcement to officially report her daughter missing. It was not a decision made lightly, but rather one born out of deep concern and maternal instinct. During the initial conversation with detectives, Jamie's mother conveyed details that cast a shadow over the situation, details that would later take on even greater significance. She told officers that Jamie had previously confided in her about persistent feelings of unease related to her living situation. Specifically, Jamie had spoken with some urgency about her growing discomfort around her stepbrother, David Haggard, with whom she shared a home. According to her mother, Jamie had never made any direct allegations or reported overt threats. However, she had repeatedly mentioned that she didn't feel entirely safe. These were not simply passing remarks. They reflected a deeper, ongoing concern that she had trouble articulating fully. At the time, the warnings had been interpreted as cautious, even anxious, but not necessarily alarming. Now, in light of her disappearance, those previously dismissed concerns took on a far more chilling resonance. Law enforcement officers responded by launching a formal investigation. Their first order of business was to conduct a meticulous search of the residence Jamie had been sharing with David. Investigators approached the property with care, examining every room, every corner, and every potential area of interest for any sign that might indicate what had happened. Despite their thoroughness, the search yielded no immediate signs of a struggle, forced entry, or anything overtly suspicious that might suggest foul play had occurred within the home. In parallel, police began canvassing the surrounding area, methodically speaking with neighbors, nearby business owners, and anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual around the time Jamie was last seen. They also requested and reviewed surveillance footage from local residences and commercial properties. A few neighbors recalled seeing Jamie earlier in the day she disappeared. One witness stated they believed they had seen her walking along the street near her home, accompanied by a man whose general appearance bore a resemblance to David. However, without conclusive video evidence or corroborating testimonies, that sighting remained speculative and could not serve as a solid lead. As days gradually turned into weeks, the atmosphere surrounding Jamie's disappearance shifted. What had begun as a missing persons case increasingly took on the weight of something far more distressing. This wasn't a matter of a person taking time to themselves or leaving town spontaneously. Jamie had simply vanished without a trace. Without contacting her children, without logging into her social media accounts, and without accessing her bank accounts, her phone remained inactive. There were no unusual financial transactions, no signs of travel, no hotel check-ins or public transportation receipts. Nothing. It was as if she had been erased from her own life in an instant. For Jamie's loved ones, the silence was both agonizing and unnatural. She was known for being attentive to her family, especially her children, and for keeping in close contact with a network of friends. She was the kind of person who wouldn't go a single day without checking in, let alone vanish without explanation. Her family, gripped by a deepening sense of dread, began taking action of their own. They distributed missing person flyers across towns and cities, plastering them on storefronts, light posts, and bulletin boards in community centers and grocery stores. Social media platforms were flooded with posts, photos, and appeals for information. Hashtags were created and shared thousands of times, drawing attention from people far beyond the immediate community. Search parties were organized by volunteers, consisting of friends, neighbors, and complete strangers who felt compelled to help. They combed through local wooded areas, park trails, abandoned buildings, and any place where someone might have gone or been taken unnoticed. Despite the growing urgency, each day ended in the same disheartening way, with no new leads and no sign of Jamie. Throughout this time, investigators continued to scrutinize those closest to her, focusing especially on David Haggard. Though he was not officially designated a suspect in the early stages of the investigation, his proximity to Jamie and the nature of their cohabitation drew increased scrutiny. Friends of Jamie described their relationship as deeply strained. There had reportedly been frequent arguments, awkward silences, and an atmosphere of tension in the home. According to people who knew Jamie well, she had described David as unpredictable, prone to emotional outbursts and mood swings that made her feel on edge. In her own words, shared with at least 2 close friends, Jamie had admitted that there were moments when she didn't feel entirely safe living under the same roof. David, for his part, told investigators that he had no idea where Jamie had gone. He insisted that there had been no argument, no incident, no catalyst that would explain her sudden absence. He theorized that she may have left of her own accord, perhaps seeking space or a fresh start somewhere else. However, this explanation was difficult for friends and family to accept. They emphasized, again and again, that Jamie would never willingly abandon her children or disappear without reaching out to someone she trusted. Investigators began working to reconstruct a timeline of Jamie's final days before she went missing. Using cell phone data, social media activity, and interviews with people who had seen her recently, they built a clearer picture of her state of mind. It became evident that she had grown increasingly uncomfortable at home. She had sent several text messages to friends expressing her frustration with her living situation. In fact, some friends revealed that Jamie had seriously considered moving out in the months before she vanished. However, financial limitations made that difficult. With limited income and with David controlling most of the household expenses, Jamie felt stuck. That feeling of helplessness, combined with rising fear, painted a far more complex portrait of her home life than had been visible from the outside. Even with these disclosures, investigators faced an uphill battle. No direct evidence tied David to Jamie's disappearance. He continued to cooperate to a minimal extent, providing statements that, on the surface, seemed plausible. But behind closed doors, law enforcement officials documented several inconsistencies in his narrative. Minor discrepancies in dates, contradictions in his recollections, and vague explanations about his whereabouts at key times. Still, these were not enough to justify legal action. One of the critical steps in the case was attempting to follow Jamie's electronic trail. Detectives worked to track her cell phone activity, but the device had been powered off shortly after she was last seen. The last known ping from her phone came from a cell tower located near the home she shared with David. While this confirmed her presence in the area around the time of her disappearance, it did little to clarify what had happened after that moment. Frustratingly, as the investigation progressed, David continued living in the shared residence. When detectives requested permission to conduct a full forensic search of the property, he declined. And without Jamie officially classified as a victim of foul play, police lacked the legal grounds for a search warrant. This limitation proved to be a significant barrier. It stalled progress, deepened suspicions, and left Jamie's family feeling increasingly helpless. Her father, Lee, and her close friends remained tireless in their efforts to keep her story alive. They pleaded with authorities, continued posting updates on social media, and kept the community engaged. But as weeks turned into months, the painful truth began to settle in. Jamie might not be coming back. Still, they clung to the possibility that answers would one day surface. Detectives, too, remained committed. As new information surfaced, the focus of their investigation tightened around David Haggard. They re-interviewed witnesses, reanalyzed timelines, and quietly re-evaluated the statements he had made early on. A particular confidant provided a critical detail. In May 2016, just 1 month prior to her vanishing, Jamie had expressed that she genuinely feared for her safety. She had even said she worried something terrible might happen if the situation with David escalated. This revelation shifted the emotional tone of the investigation. It no longer felt like a case of a woman who might have left due to personal reasons. It now felt like a matter of potential harm, possibly the result of a volatile household dynamic that had gone unaddressed for too long. Despite this growing unease, David maintained the same position. He continued to tell police that Jamie had problems she kept hidden, and that perhaps she had chosen to leave because of those internal struggles. He denied any wrongdoing and pointed to her supposed desire for a new beginning as a possible explanation. Yet following Jamie's disappearance, his behavior changed noticeably. Neighbors reported that he had become withdrawn and socially distant. On several occasions, residents mentioned unusual odors coming from the house, unsettling enough that multiple people remembered them specifically when questioned by police. But again, without the legal authority to search the home, detectives could only observe from a distance. Eventually, with pressure mounting and circumstantial suspicions growing, investigators submitted a request to the court for a warrant to conduct a detailed search of the home. But despite everything, despite the inconsistencies, the witness accounts, the subtle behavioral shifts, the request was denied. The judge ruled that there was still no direct, tangible evidence implicating David in Jamie's disappearance. As the months dragged on with no answers, the weight of uncertainty became unbearable for Jamie Haggard's loved ones. The lack of new leads in the investigation cast a long and heavy shadow over everyone connected to the case. There were no fresh clues, no breakthroughs, no anonymous tips, just silence. For Jamie's family, each day without answers was a reminder of the void her disappearance had left. For the detectives working the case, the emotional toll was coupled with professional frustration. Still, they persisted. Though the trail had gone cold, investigators refused to give up. They knew that if someone close to Jamie, particularly her stepbrother David Haggard, was involved in her disappearance, time might become their ally. People under pressure make mistakes, and police hoped that with consistent surveillance, meticulous observation, and patience, David would eventually slip up. They monitored his behavior discreetly, studied his routines, and remained ready to respond to any development, no matter how small. Then, nearly 2 full years after Jamie had vanished without a trace, the case took a chilling turn. In May of 2018, a pair of hunters walking through a wooded area near a highway in Snohomish County stumbled upon something unexpected: a discarded suitcase, lying partially hidden beneath brush and debris. Its appearance struck them as odd. It didn't look like it belonged in that remote location. When authorities arrived and examined the contents, the suitcase was transported to the forensic lab for detailed analysis. DNA testing later confirmed what Jamie's family had long feared but never wanted to accept. The DNA belonged to Jamie Haggard. After 2 agonizing years, her family had an answer, though not the one they had hoped for. The discovery was devastating. Jamie's loved ones, especially her children and her father, had held on to the possibility that she might return one day, perhaps having gone away to rebuild her life in secret. Now that hope was extinguished. The suitcase itself became an immediate and vital piece of evidence. Investigators determined that it had once belonged to David Haggard. This connection reignited the investigation with renewed urgency. Suddenly, detectives had a tangible link, a physical object tying David more closely to Jamie's fate. Yet even with this revelation, law enforcement faced a challenge: establishing a direct and provable connection between David and the act that led to Jamie's death. As the investigation resumed with intensified focus, forensic teams combed over every item associated with the suitcase and the area where it was found. The suitcase appeared to have been discarded not long after Jamie was reported missing, suggesting a deliberate attempt to hide it early in the investigation. The location, a secluded stretch not far from a highway David was known to frequent, added to the growing suspicion. Still, suspicion alone wouldn't be enough for a conviction. Among the new evidence was a segment of rope found near the discovery site. Forensic experts quickly identified it as a common household material, but what made it significant was that it matched rope observed in David's home during earlier visits by police. While this strengthened the case, it still fell short of meeting the threshold for immediate legal action. Despite this, detectives were determined. They worked meticulously to construct a timeline, revisit past witness statements, and pursue any leads that had previously gone cold. Meanwhile, the public reaction was swift and intense. The discovery of Jamie struck a nerve in the community. Residents expressed sorrow. Many voiced frustration that despite so many warning signs, no arrest had been made. Candlelight vigils were held across the county. Community advocates and online groups amplified the case, urging law enforcement and the district attorney's office to act decisively. Jamie's name began appearing in local news cycles once again, not as a missing person, but as the victim of a crime in need of resolution. By the fall of 2019, a year after Jamie's discovery, the investigative team had finally made the critical progress they needed. In October 2019, David Haggard was officially arrested and charged with second-degree murder in connection with the death of Jamie Haggard. The arrest came after months of additional evidence gathering, including new witness interviews, forensic analysis, and digital forensics that placed him in incriminating proximity to key evidence. The turning point was a series of matches between physical items recovered from the scene and those found in David's possession. Forensic analysts concluded beyond reasonable doubt that the suitcase had indeed belonged to David. Further testing revealed fingerprints on the rope that matched his, providing what investigators referred to as critical physical corroboration. When authorities arrived to arrest David at his residence, he reportedly appeared startled and anxious. Though he denied the charges, claiming to have no knowledge of Jamie's death, his responses to questions were inconsistent. He suggested that he had been framed, that someone else must have planted the evidence. However, detectives noted that during questioning, David exhibited signs of stress. He stumbled over dates, contradicted earlier statements, and struggled to explain his activities on the day Jamie was last seen. The interrogation process, parts of which were later released to the public, offered a deeper glimpse into David's mindset. While not overtly incriminating on their own, his shifting tone, defensive posture, and visible discomfort under questioning reinforced the prosecution's belief that they had their suspect. In parallel, detectives expanded their inquiry by speaking with individuals from David's past, neighbors, former co-workers, and acquaintances. Several described a man who had grown increasingly irritable in the months before Jamie's disappearance. Some remembered hearing heated arguments between the two. Others noted that David seemed agitated whenever Jamie's name came up in conversation. These testimonies helped solidify a narrative of escalating tension inside the shared household. Still, prosecutors knew that securing a conviction would require more than suspicion, hearsay, or emotional appeal. They needed to construct a clear and compelling case based on evidence, science, and corroborated testimony. The legal process would be complex, and the burden of proof high. For Jamie's family, the arrest of David Haggard was both a moment of relief and the beginning of a new emotional journey. They had endured years of uncertainty, heartache, and unanswered questions. Now, with the suspect in custody, the focus shifted towards seeking justice through the courts. They understood that a long legal process lay ahead, but they were committed to seeing it through, because Jamie's life mattered and her story deserved to be told in full. As developments in Jamie Haggard's case began to unfold in the public eye, the level of community involvement and emotional investment only deepened. Her story had long transcended the boundaries of a simple missing persons case. It had become a haunting symbol of the unseen dangers that can exist within a family and a sobering reminder of what can happen when warning signs are ignored or misunderstood. With the case finally moving toward legal resolution, public attention shifted to the next crucial phase: the trial. For many, it represented a long overdue opportunity to hold someone accountable, to see justice rendered not just in name, but in fact. The trial would be the final test of the years-long investigation, a chance to determine once and for all whether David Haggard would be held responsible for the death of his stepsister, Jamie Haggard. The courtroom proceedings began in mid-2022, nearly 6 years after Jamie first went missing. David Haggard stood formally charged with second-degree murder, a charge that indicated authorities believed the act had not been premeditated, but had resulted from an intentional and violent response. The trial attracted significant local media attention and drew widespread interest from residents across Snohomish County, many of whom had followed the case from the beginning. People gathered outside the courthouse, watched news segments closely, and filled courtroom benches whenever possible. This trial was not just about one man or one family. It had become a matter of collective concern. From the outset, the prosecution presented a strong and structured narrative. Their case was built on a combination of forensic evidence, expert testimony, and first-hand witness accounts. Central to their argument were 3 pivotal components: the suitcase, linked directly to David Haggard, a length of rope bearing his fingerprints, and evidence of fire damage, which forensic analysts interpreted as an attempt to destroy evidence and obscure the timeline of Jamie's death. In addition to the physical items, David's own words became a major point of contention. Video recordings from police interrogations were shown in court, revealing moments where he contradicted himself. Prosecutors argued that his evasive behavior and shifting accounts of events were signs of a guilty conscience. They emphasized that David had complete control over the household Jamie lived in, including unrestricted access to the items tied to the crime. His behavior in the aftermath, marked by emotional detachment and inconsistency, further reinforced, in their view, his involvement. Moreover, prosecutors presented a broader motive theory, highlighting the tense relationship between David and Jamie in the months leading up to her disappearance. Witnesses described heated arguments, Jamie's increasing fear of her stepbrother, and her expressed desire to leave the home she shared with him. This testimony provided context and gave jurors a sense of the emotional climate that may have preceded the crime. Meanwhile, the defense team pushed back forcefully, maintaining David's innocence from start to finish. Their strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt by pointing out what they described as circumstantial weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys argued that the suitcase and rope, while found near Jamie's, could not conclusively prove David was the person who used them in connection with the crime. They suggested the possibility that the suitcase had been taken from his home without his knowledge, or planted. They also challenged the fingerprint evidence, saying that shared household items inevitably contained traces from multiple people. Furthermore, the defense claimed that public bias had tainted the investigation. They argued that because David had been scrutinized early on and portrayed as suspicious in the media, investigators had pursued him to the exclusion of other possibilities. The defense portrayed David as a man caught in a storm of assumption, circumstance, and tragedy, not as a killer. The most emotionally powerful moments of the trial came from the testimonies of Jamie's family and close friends. In tearful statements, they spoke of Jamie's deep devotion to her children, her generosity of spirit, and her fear of the situation at home before her disappearance. Her mother's statement to the court stood out as especially moving. She described the agony of not knowing, the heartbreak of losing a daughter who had so much life left to live, and the long years of waiting for answers. Her words hung heavily in the courtroom, leaving a profound impact on those present. As the trial moved into its final days, forensic experts were called once again to clarify the scientific evidence. After weeks of proceedings, arguments, and emotionally charged testimony, the case was handed over to the jury for deliberation. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was tense. Inside, Jamie's family waited silently, holding on to the hope that their long journey toward justice was nearing its conclusion. In October 2022, after several days of careful deliberation, The jury returned with its verdict. David Haggard was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Jamie Haggard. The courtroom remained quiet for several moments as the words were read aloud. Then came tears, some of sorrow, others of relief. After years of not knowing, of hoping, fearing, and searching, Jamie's family finally had an answer. The verdict marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Though the conviction brought a measure of closure, it could never replace what was lost. For Jamie's children, the verdict did not bring their mother back. For her parents, it didn't erase the pain of her absence. But it did provide accountability, a rare and hard-won outcome in cases that often remain unresolved. In December 2022, 2 months after the verdict, David's sentencing hearing was held. The court imposed a 15-year prison sentence, taking into account the severity of the crime, the years-long deception, and David's lack of prior criminal convictions. The judge acknowledged the weight of the case, noting that while no sentence could restore what had been taken, the legal system had done what it could within the boundaries of the law. The sentence brought mixed reactions. While the prosecution and Jamie's family accepted the outcome, some members of the community believed the sentence was too lenient given the emotional and psychological toll the crime had inflicted. Still, there was widespread agreement that the legal process had delivered the justice many feared might never come. At the sentencing hearing, Jamie's mother addressed the court once more. In a voice filled with pain and determination, she said, "I hoped this day would never come, but now we know the truth. My daughter deserved more from life. She deserved safety, love, and a future with her children. We hope her story will remind others to speak out, to act when something feels wrong, and to never stop fighting for justice." Throughout the proceedings, David Haggard remained largely expressionless. Even in his final court appearance, he maintained his innocence and claimed he had been wrongly convicted. His legal team, shortly after sentencing, filed an appeal, arguing that the evidence remained circumstantial and that public opinion may have unfairly influenced the jury's decision. But for prosecutors, and for Jamie's family, the evidence had spoken clearly. They remained confident in the outcome and hopeful that the conviction would be upheld. As time passed and the courtroom lights dimmed, so too did the intensity of public attention surround Jamie Haggard's case. Yet for those closest to Jamie, the story did not end with a guilty verdict or a sentencing hearing. Determined to turn loss into purpose, Jamie's family took action. In the months following David Haggard's conviction, her relatives announced the creation of the Jamie Haggard Foundation, a nonprofit organization established to support individuals. The foundation quickly became a vehicle for healing and awareness, offering resources to those in crisis and shining a light on the warning signs that had gone unnoticed or unspoken in Jamie's case.